Hello, Smart Money Tree podcast listeners. Welcome to this week's show. My name is Kirk Chisholm, and I will be your host. So today we have a good friend of mine, Bobbi Rebel. Hey, Bobbi, how you doing?
Hi, thank you for having me. This is so great.
Well, glad to have you on the show. I was just fortunate enough to be on your show in the recent weeks, and thank you again for having me. But I wanted to bring you on because you're just a fountain of wisdom here. Maybe you can tell the listeners a little bit about your background so they can get to know you better.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you again for having me. I actually have a very unusual background for someone that's a podcaster and a corporate spokesperson and an author. I've written a couple of books. I actually started out wanting to be a general reporter journalist and was talked into doing financial news by my father, who was a Wall Street investment banker, and remains disappointed that I am not a Wall Street investment banker. But we compromised, and he agreed to support my endeavors as long as I did some internships in financial news. So I did some internships in financial news, got very interested in it actually because the journalists there were absolutely terrific at CNN, and I learned how much I didn't know and how much I wanted to know, and started taking a bunch of classes. I took classes on the Fed. I took classes on technical analysis of stocks and all the super nerdy things that you can imagine. Long story short, when I graduated, I did go to work at CNBC as a production assistant. They actually call it a news associate. Moved on from there to jobs at CNN, and then at a PBS show that's no longer with us, but was a great show called The Nightly Business Report, where I started doing on-air reporting, and then eventually landed at Thomson Reuters as a global business news anchor. I actually ran the US video business by the time I was leaving, and also wrote a globally syndicated column focusing on personal finance issues. So I had a big journalism career up until just a few years ago. And then I decided to start writing books, and I wanted to spend more time with my family. And actually, as much as I love journalism, I really wanted to do something that was a little bit more impactful than the stuff I was covering. I was doing a lot of CEO interviews, a lot of reporting on what the Fed did and what the market was doing. And it's very sort of almost presented as this sort of detached, almost like sports reporting when you talk about television news about finance. And I felt it wasn't really doing everyone justice when you wanted to really invest, that it made a lot more sense to be thoughtful and think about your own personal situation. And I became much more interested in personal finance rather than just sort of this onslaught of information that I was throwing at my viewers. And so my first book was How to Be a Financial Grownup, and it presented a lot of opportunities that I couldn't really do while still being a full-time journalist, at least at a place as sort of ethical as Thomson Reuters, because they don't let you ever earn money from anything other than the journalism, which is ethically right, but also not very lucrative for me. And so I stepped off the journalism path, followed up on the opportunities presented by my book, started my podcast, which is now Money Tips for Financial Grownups, and then also started working with some brands and doing some anchor work representing some financial brands. I've worked with brands like JP Morgan Asset Management. I've worked with Synchrony, GenTrust. And I work with Tally, which is a debt management app. So I've worked with a lot of great brands, and recently came out with my second book called Launching Financial Grownups, which is all about how parents, grandparents, and frankly, anyone that cares about the next generation of investors can help them get on track and set the next generation up for success, which is something that I'm very passionate about. That was a lot.
I don't think anyone could say you're lazy, Bobbi. Yeah, there's a lot.
Yeah. Along the way, I have a blended family here in New York City where I live. I have stepchildren, which inspired, by the way, the book, and we can talk about them, and blended family and teaching kids about money. And then I have a now 15-year-old, and of course, my husband, and most importantly, our Morky Waffles, who is often featured on my Instagram.
Well, there's a lot to chew on there. So let's talk about what it means to be a financial grown-up, because that's a big part of your branding. So when you say financial grown-up, what does that mean?
So it means something different to everyone, which is something that I love. So first of all, to me, it basically means being secure enough in my knowledge of what's going on with respect to my own personal finances that I know I'm going to be okay, because you never have all the answers. The question is, are you set up and ready to manage whatever comes your way? It can be as simple as having enough money in an emergency fund that you can sleep at night. It can also mean you're on track to meet different goals. It can also mean just you're planning your family's vacations and you know how they're going to be financed. Whatever it is that matters to you, you have the knowledge, or you know how to get the information to do what you want to do when it comes to your money and your overall life goals. For other people, it can mean different things, but the idea is that you know what you need to know or how to get the information to be a grown-up and be self-sufficient.
So I don't want to talk about age, but you're a Gen Xer, right, Bobbi?
I am a Gen Xer, the forgotten generation.
The forgotten, the
I love
toughest generation.
well, and we see there's so many graphics. This is a pet peeve. We're going to vent for just a little bit. When news, because I'm a journalist, when the news comes on and they do these generational polls, next time I want everyone to look closely because they don't put us in there. They have boomers. Sometimes they'll even have the greatest generation. Then they'll have millennials, and then they'll have Gen Z. Where are we? We are here and we matter, Kirk.
Well, it seems to me, that you read some of these books about the generational shifts, like The Fourth Turning, where they talk about these big generational shifts and talk about the boomers, and then they talk about, the kids of the boomers, the millennials. And, what's fascinating is when you talk about culture and how culture changes and who's impacting culture, right? And the boomers are still impacting culture. It shouldn't be. It should be Gen X should be impacting culture at this stage. Now, the millennials and the Gen Z and like the youngest, like they're technically impacting culture from like what people are wearing, what's cool. But when you talk about impacting culture from like politics and corporate business, it should be Gen X, but the boomers will never leave. They won't retire. You still got like 90-year-olds in Congress. Like it's crazy. They just won't leave.
Yeah. I have no comments on that other than, if people are watching us on camera, they can see my expression. We're going to claim our proper territory.
I hope so.
Hope.
So let's talk about that, because I mean, as a Gen Xer, I mean, that obviously has a big impact into kind of a lot what you wrote and being a financial grown-up. But like, what was the impact like growing up? Because I talk about that sometimes in the show about me. But like, what did you see the same thing? Like, what did you see growing up?
You mean from my parents? I'm confused.
Yeah, just what was your experience like as a Gen Xer? Like, what's that like?
Yeah, so this is interesting. So a lot of what I write about is that we became helicopter parents. We are now becoming very much concierge parents, where through technology, we're available. We can be reached at all times. I've got a kid at boarding school, and let me tell you, the communication is flowing, especially when I put on parental controls or when I don't put money in one of his bank accounts that he needs for going out to dinner with his buddies or whatever they're doing. And the truth is, and I'm guilty of this too, and working on it, I read my own book back because it's full of expert advice. We're available at all times thanks to communication that we didn't have growing up. We couldn't text our parents. And we often solve our young adult children's problems with money. So like a concierge, we're available pretty much all the time to solve problems, often with money, right? Our parents, to us Gen Xers, did none of that. I mean, my dad worked on Wall Street. My mom was a lawyer, and they traveled a lot and they were busy. And I had a conversation with my brother somewhat recently, and I said, how did my parents do all these things? And he kind of said, well, they left us at home. And I was like, well, who was watching us? And he said, well, I know our aunt lived a few houses away, and we did have a housekeeper that came in. And this is baffling. And yet we somehow went to school. We all graduated from high school and college, and all the things happened, but somehow without such a hands-on approach. I don't know why we do the things we do. Some of it is explained in the book through experts, but maybe it's reactive. But I know that, I don't think my parents were as protective as I am towards my son. I think we just do a lot more. We schedule them a lot more. We put them in a lot more activities. Everything is much more organized and formal. I'd be curious to know what you think. And by the way, I should add, much more expensive on all levels.
Yeah, no, I think my experience is similar. We're known as the latchkey kids, or the forgotten generation, where the parents worked and you got home from school and no one was home.
Yeah.
No one told you not to put the fork in the light switch socket. No one told you, not to put a hair dryer in the bathtub when you're bathing. Like, you just figured things out. Of course there
Hmm.
were cartoons that were like, like GI Joe cartoons, like, there's a down power line, call somebody, don't touch it, don't play with it, like all these little, like, these little tidbits of information. I had cartoons teaching me how to act, Bobbi.
Yeah.
The parents got
Yeah.
home for dinner. You got home and you were, you had to stay in the house, but then the parents got home and they're like, all right, time for dinner. And you had to show up for dinner and do all these things. But, in the summer, it was like, be home by dark, because that's when we're going to have
Yeah.
dinner. That was it. And, like,
Yeah. And yeah.
don't play in traffic, I guess. Like, there wasn't any guidance, and we all
Yeah.
managed to survive. And,
Hmm.
we all managed to be, I think of it as, we're all more resilient because of it. And this
Hmm.
is a struggle I have, and I'm sure you do too. And I think our generation does in a lot of ways. Like, we had some struggles. We had to be resilient. We had to kind of tough it out. The 70s weren't pretty for a lot of people, but, you and I probably weren't economically viable. We weren't spending money, but it was tough. And I think a lot of people had to work to make ends meet. The 80s were a little bit better and kept getting better, but they were still, kind of tough. So I think that probably played into it a lot. But a lot of people they were left to their own devices, and the people who succeeded were the people who were driven and had to. And then a lot of people just kind of, did a whole lot of nothing. And so I think, reflecting back on it myself, when I think about it, like, I want the best for my kids. I want my kids to have the opportunities that they can have. But on the other hand, I struggle because I'm like, if they don't have to struggle, then they're not
Hmm.
going to have that drive to succeed that most of the people in my generation had, because we had to. And if things
Yeah.
are easy, are we ruining their lives because we're making it too
Yeah.
easy?
So while my book does do a little bit of, kind of reading parents like myself, the Riot Act, and kind of saying we need to stop ourselves and let our kids have these life experiences so they can develop the resiliency that you're talking about, I do want to point out that there are certain things that we as parents now deal with and Gen Xers deal with that our parents did not have to deal with. So for example, social media, right? And all of the electronics that go on. So in a way, it's a good thing. For example, I don't know if my son knows this, but I have a tracker in his luggage. So when he goes back to school, I know not only do I have his phone, number one, tracked, which he knows, I think he knows, and we can all track each other and know what we're doing. If he forgets his luggage, at least I have a tracker in it, right? So we have all these devices that are actually, for the most part, pretty good, right? But on the other hand, we have so many temptations and they have so many temptations and distractions and things that can also mess with their mental well-being that just simply did not exist. I mean, I think we had slam books, which can be very cruel, maybe more so for girls than for boys, but we didn't have these apps where people can say bad things about each other. Now there's an app called Gas that I heard about that says only nice things about people. It's kind of, I think gas means like pump, like to kind of give everyone some happy energy is
Not
the meaning of
gaslighting.
that. No, not gaslighting, but it's actually really positive because my son got some notes like, this girl likes you from your old high school and things like that. So it's nice. So there's some effort going into that, but overall the social media is bad for kids, especially young girls, less so for boys, but certainly for boys. And the distraction of video games is much more intense than it was. It used to be isolated to a console at home. Now, you really can't not get your kid a phone because of safety reasons and at a certain age and different things. So, they all have these devices and we're battling them because it's a love-hate thing. And then the pandemic made it even tougher because we're telling our kids to be on the screen all day and then we're telling them to limit their screen time. And we've sort of created an impossible situation. So it's tricky. It is very tricky. I love it that I can send him money on an app though. If he doesn't have cash and he's somewhere, he can text me and I can just send over a few bucks for whatever he actually needs. Is that the best way to teach him about money? I don't know.
Yeah, that's a struggle. I was taught with physical dollar bills. Like, my dad, sometimes you had to order something online and it was, mail order and you needed a credit card. And of course I didn't have one. So he said, all right, you give me the cash in advance and I'll let you use my credit card. I had to pay in cash at the time. It wasn't pay him later. But I think there's a lot of good takeaways from there. Cause I think about, some of the things you said, some of the temptations growing up, you had to wait by the phone. You know, like, I remember when I was a teenager, like, you're waiting for a girl to call, you're waiting by the phone, or hey, I have to meet up with a buddy. Like, you're waiting by the phone for your buddy to call. You're not like out and about doing whatever. And it was so different. Remember payphones, Bobby? Remember,
Hmm.
remember
I
that?
remember when we left voice messages on, there was like a machine that
Yeah.
you left a voice message on, and you could call in remotely to get your messages to find out where your friends were.
Yeah, that was high tech. We didn't have that for a while, but
Maybe I'm a smidge younger, but yeah, I remember that. So
yeah, but
yeah,
I
but
think
yeah.
the structure now, and this, I think this is the interesting part that you were talking about, is, social media. It hasn't been around long enough to really see the impact. Online gaming, or the new one, which I just found out. I don't know if you've done this, Bobby, but the new one, which is brand new, is Chat GBT, which is like crack for me. I was on it all weekend. I didn't sleep. I was up till 2 a.m. It is so fascinating. You could go down so many rabbit holes with it. We could talk off the show, but
What
I've
is
been
it?
doing. So it's AI. It's a
Okay.
language-based AI. I actually done a lot of LinkedIn posts on it in the last few weeks, and I have one on getting started if you want to check it out. But it's basically, you go to this website and there's no direction. It's totally choose your own adventure. You put in commands and it'll respond. So I might say, write me a short story with this tone about this topic, and you give it directions, it will just do it. And it's, I can have it write, and you'll love this. I wanted to, I tested it out. I said, all right, I want to write an article that's SEO friendly on this topic. And in 5 minutes, I have a fully written article, SEO friendly, all designed in 5 minutes, which would have taken me a day or longer because I'm slow. Now, I will mind you, it's 80% good. So it's an 80-20 rule. It gets you 80% there. That 20% you have to do because there's something missing, like personality is missing, but otherwise it's solid it'll do code, it'll debug code for you. Like, it is one of those things you will get lost for hours.
Okay. I have mixed feelings about whether I even want to go there.
Yeah.
And I'm
Don't
feeling
tell your
really
kids.
good that I've moved out of journalism. I
I
know we
wouldn't.
did have that at Thomson Reuters, where there were there was something they were experimenting with. And I hope I don't get it wrong. But it was something like when an earnings report came out from a company, this AI was able to scan it for the key elements and then put it into an article.
Yep.
If that makes sense. And because it was very specific what information it was looking for from these corporate earnings reports. And that was fascinating because that's putting they said it's not going to put reporters out of business. It just would allow reporters to do more thoughtful pieces. Who's to say? But it was still really scary as a journalist.
Yeah, I would imagine this. And actually, it's funny because this came out in November. In like 5 days, they got like 1 million people signed up, and they didn't tell anybody about it. And not only that, in December, some college kid in Princeton wrote a algorithm and created an app. So you could determine with this app what is written by AI and what's written by humans. So this will be an interesting battleground for the next few years. It's totally fast. You need to learn about it just because it's where things are going.
Yeah.
Which is why I did it. But now it's like, oh my God, it's like crack. Where's my methadone?
Yeah, I'm definitely not telling my teenager about that. I could see all kinds of school reports being auto-generated.
Yep.
From that.
One college actually banned the website from the campus. You can't use it on the campus.
Good for them.
That's not going to stop kids from using it, but
no, but at least at least it's there, that they've made a statement about it and said, we have expectations for our students and we want to see your work. And we want people to be, when you're a student, it's not always the best thing to just kind of fool the teachers. Of course, you want to get the good grades, but ultimately you want the education you're paying for. I mean, look, you're talking to somebody, I became a certified financial planner for fun, right? So, I mean, what's the point of beating the system? And just to explain, I'm not a practicing certified financial planner, but my first employer, CNBC, had a program where they would pay for the classes. And so being the frugal person that I am, I decided, well, I better take classes, constantly to make sure I get my full compensation, because it's part of my compensation package. So I did spend really every weekend for the time I was at CNBC taking classes, which included the classes to become a certified financial planner, and later took and passed the test. So I became a CFP for fun. I've never practiced. Just for
Congrats.
fun, Kirk. Who does that?
Not me. Not me, Bobbi, but I appreciate that you're willing to do it. Oh, so, I want to kind of dive in a little bit because, you've written a lot about being a financial grown-up, and I want to talk a little bit about generational money. And, when you talk about next gen and how that transitions, this is one thing I see in my profession all the time. I even had a conversation this morning with a new client. We were talking about how, the generational money and what people think about it and who's involved, who isn't involved. So to me, it's a deep rabbit hole, but I'm curious on your thoughts on it because you've obviously written a lot about it.
Well, that's the inspiration really for the book and for so much of my work, is that the older generation, I think the statistic is something like $68 trillion is going to be passed down in the next few years, the next decade or so. How is that money going to transition, and what is that going to mean? Is the next generation prepared for that money? And in many cases, the answer is no. And in as much as there's statistics also that as many as 95% of the next generation that inherits money is not going to stay with their parents' financial advisors. So where is this going? And I have this deep fear. I don't want to name some app-based trading platforms, but I do have this deep fear that people that don't become financial grown-ups could really squander this money. It may sound like a big inheritance if you're inheriting X dollars, whatever the number might be, but I know from observation, I have many people that I've heard about and know personally that can go through extreme amounts of money through foolish investments very often. I think sometimes when people inherit a lot of money, they mean well, but they might become an angel investor and they don't fully vet so many firms and startups. You've talked about this. Startups are incredibly risky, right? Yep. And they might not properly diversify. Yes, if you want diversification, for example, in an S&P fund, okay, fine. But a lot of people diversify in ways that aren't actually diversifying. So I think there's a real need for the financial advisor community to get involved with the next generation that is inheriting this money and help them stay on track. I'm not sure that that is set up to happen. And I think that's really alarming in a theoretical sense, but also personally as someone who's had successful parents, who thinks about this a lot, who has had amazing discussions with my father about his wishes and how he earned his money, how he invests his money, what his expectations are for his children, and discussions with, quite honestly, his wealth advisors about our needs, our goals, etc. We've had these multi-generational conversations. I worry that they're not taking place enough and that we have to start amplifying the need to be having these conversations, not only so the next generation doesn't blow it, which they will in many cases, but also to give comfort to the older generation that all the hard work that they've done and all the meticulous and thoughtful investing and asset allocation that has gone into their wealth building over the years is not for nothing. And that the next generation and the generation after that is going to be set up for success. And I think that advisors are finally waking up to this need, which is, by the way, also a business opportunity, but it is very much a need for their clients, the older clients who will pass on this money, to have that comfort that you can't just set up all these trusts and just say, you can't access it because the money manager's in charge. That's not the way to go. You've got to take the time to bring in the next generation, educate them, make them feel part of it, give them a sense of ownership, give them a sense of responsibility, let them know your expectations, but also let them know that not only do you believe they are competent, or you'll get there to be competent to make decisions with these financial advisors, but that you have confidence in them. Because what we often do to our children, Kirk, and this goes back to the helicopter parenting and the concierge parents, is we don't focus on competence, but even more than competence is confidence. When you do something for a child, an adult child, or a late teenager child, for them, that they should be able to do by themselves, you're saying, I don't think you're ready for this yet. I don't believe in you. I don't think you can do it. You're not capable. Let me help you. You have to give them the room to show you or find their way to figure out how to do it on their own. And that might mean not paying off their credit card if they built up debt. It might mean letting them blow some money on, and putting their money, I'm not even going to say, but some things that have blown up lately. A small amount, hopefully, but let them feel the experience of losing money, of making a foolish investment. So they'll be a little bit more aware and maybe do some more proactive research. We all have made the mistake of getting the investment advice from a friend, and we assume that that friend has vetted it, but they may have just gotten it from another friend or from a money manager who's their trusted family friend or whatever. And then we put our money in and then it's gone. And we have no one to blame but ourselves, but yet we thought they vetted it. I saw recently a clip, I believe it was Kevin O'Leary, and I think he was saying, it was definitely one of the FTX investors that was a big name, that he had assumed because other people had supposedly vetted FTX. He assumed because certain people had invested that it was vetted and he didn't do his own homework. This has happened over and over again. It also happened with, what was the one? She's now going to jail. The company that had the medical
Holmes.
Theranos.
Yeah,
Theranos, yeah. You put famous people on the board, everyone assumes it's got the seal of approval, and nobody checked to even make sure the technology worked because, all these other people were involved. Of course, they checked. And so it's so important for us to teach our children that they have to do their own homework and they have to develop the skills to do their own homework, or they need to really be careful about who they hire in terms of financial or wealth advisors to help them vet. You don't have to be the expert, but you have to find the experts and really ask them, when you say you vetted it, tell us what you mean. Because there was a guy named Bernie Madoff that had a lot of really well-respected money managers that assured their clients they had vetted it, but clearly they didn't, because he didn't actually even own the stocks he said he owned. I mean, there was nothing there, and nobody caught it because everybody trusted him. So that's my rant.
No, I love it, Bobbi. I think that's you're hitting the nail on the head right there. I think of it this way. A friend of mine told me this, and I thought it was a brilliant analogy, which is, the way Wall Street and investors get their information is there's one person in a room doing the research. Then there's one person who knows that person. And then there's someone who knows the person, knows the person. Then there's somebody who knows the person, knows the person, knows the person. And everyone else here is at a cocktail party. Like, that's Wall Street. You don't even know who's doing the research. You just hope somebody's doing it, and you hope they're not crazy. Because it's Wall Street 101 every time. And it's happened with SBF, and it's happened with all sorts of stuff. Oh, it's going up. Let's just buy it. They don't know why it's going up. They don't care. Just, hey, let's just go on for a ride. One thing I'm curious about, because this seems to be an ongoing theme, is with the generational shift, is when people inherit money, whether it's newfound money, especially with young kids, like if they're athletes or celebrities, or if they inherit money or they win the lottery, they have this lottery winner syndrome where they tend to lose it within 2 years. What would you recommend for people who kind of come into money, and what are some tips you can give them to help them kind of find the right path? Because some people, they just don't know what they don't know, and that's a hard place to start.
Yeah. Well, I think the best thing you can do is then just don't start. Just take a break. Do nothing. You might, quote, miss out on some upside if you were going to invest it somewhere that would go up. And we know the stock market might not have gone up during that 6-month period. Yes, you could lose out, but you could also not lose. So I would really take a do nothing for a while approach, especially when it comes to people asking you for things. I would not put it all in one place. I think as much as, places are vetted, you never know. We've had some surprises. So I would definitely diversify where that money is held, even though people will say, if you give me everything I'll take a smaller percentage to some degree. But really, you want to make sure to diversify who is holding your money. Never put all your eggs in one basket, and don't rush into anything, most of all.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. Yeah, I think it's great advice. So in the interest of time, we probably have to wrap it up here. But what are some final thoughts you can leave our audience with, and maybe some tips for how people can be better financial grownups?
I think one of the things that I've learned through my journey of writing these 2 books is that we have to focus, yes, on our goals and on the day-to-day things. Like, don't spend more money than you can afford, than you make, then, watch your incoming money, what you're spending, all the basic things. That's all great. You can get a laundry list, not only from my books, but from many good books that are out there. Many apps that are out there can teach you the basics of just managing your everyday money. But the problems come when we create anxiety about whether we'll be financially secure, whether we will reach goals like having enough money to retire, whether we have enough money if something bad happens. I myself have had many times where I have stayed up at night with financial anxiety. We have financial anxiety if we are in a job that we, want to leave. Could we afford to leave? If we're worried that our company might have layoffs. We're hearing a lot these days about layoffs. At the end of the day, it's so important to have coping strategies while life is going on, because I don't know anyone, there's this bar, I don't know if it's kind of a barroom joke or whatever, but like, what's your number? Like, what's your magic number? And if you have this number, you will be financially secure. You can retire. You will never have to work again. What's your number? And people throw out all kinds of numbers. It used to be 5 million, 10 million, whatever it is. But the truth is, the number is never really there, because when you get there, there's a new number, right? So it's more important that we make peace with where we are in life, have plans to get where we want to go, but most of all, have coping strategies for living a happy life while we're on that journey. And that's a lot of what I'm talking about in my new business, which is called Financial Wellness Strategies, is ways to feel good about your money and put specific action steps in place. I'm not just talking about, let's just do meditation and it will all be okay. No, you have to do the work. But while you're doing the work and putting plans in place, like, for example, if you have debt, knowing that if you pay this amount directly from your paycheck for this many weeks, it will be done. That's going to give you peace of mind, because you know exactly when it's going to end. It may not end for years, but you have the end date, and you can do the math and say, okay, if I can put this much more in, it will end on this sooner end date. Put those plans in place. But by doing that, you're going to feel a lot more comfortable in your life, and you're going to be able to focus on actually enjoying your friends and family and the things that you want to do, the experiences that you want to have. And I hate this cliche, but I'm going to say it: live your best life.
I don't hate that. I use
You don't
that all
hate
the
that?
time.
I feel like it's overused. Okay.
I love
Good.
it. I mean, I think it's hard when you get into the emotional side of money with things. There's a lot of people out there talking about it, but not explaining it. And they'll just say things because they sound good. But, I think realistically, people need to hear that. I mean, if especially the baby boomer generation, which worked really hard and saved a lot of money, and they don't know how to turn it off. They don't know how to retire. They don't know how to say, all right, I'm done. And these are hard challenges, right? We go through generational shifts in our own lives, and people don't like change. So living your best life, I think, the younger generation, actually, I'll give them credit. I don't give them credit for a lot of things, because I think there's a lot of problems with the millennials and Gen Z and all that. But I think, when you think about it, like, they actually have this down. They're trying to live their best life today. They're not saving it until they're 65 or 70, like we were taught. Work hard, save money, and when you retire, you can do whatever you want. Well, that's assuming you're alive when you retire, and it's also assuming that you saved enough, and it's assuming that you can afford it. And there's a lot of assumptions that go in for 40 years from now. Whereas the younger generation are thinking, hey, well, let's just live it today. I would have loved to have done what they do, but that wasn't the culture when I graduated. So
I love that you're saying that. We're also, and this is a Gen X thing, and baby boomers, we have been marketed to with these idyllic impressions of retirement, where we reach the age of, let's say, 65. They're moving the goalpost a little bit these days, which is actually a good thing. Where, you got the Adirondack chairs looking at the sunset, with your spouse of, 40 years, and you can travel, and you've got the perfect grandchildren, running around you. And I don't know that that's what everybody wants. It's just, it's just a way to kind of keep us as sort of hamsters on the treadmill kind of thing, or hamster wheel people. I don't know that that's so healthy either. So I think a lot of the financial wellness comes from the idea that we have to get off that hamster wheel, stop buying into this notion that we need to work to what the marketing companies say is the ideal, which is sitting in Adirondack chairs with our grandchildren running around looking at the sunset. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it's sort of this goal. And then again, even the retirement calculators on the HR websites have this, are you on track for your goal? And it will sort of do the math for you. It's very stressful, right? It's very stressful. So I think we have to move away from the numbers and move into, am I doing the proactive things? Actually, just like I said, you do have to actually do things to get to your financial goals, but then taking a step back, taking a breath, and putting things in perspective, focusing on health, which is a huge thing. I can tell you from, being the daughter of a mother that died very young, she never collected Social Security. You know what I mean? She never really retired. So what was the point? It's just kind of, I don't know. It's important to keep that perspective and really focus on your mindset and your approach to money and to your financial health and to where you are on your financial grown-up journey as you're going through life, instead of waiting to reach some sort of arbitrary finish line that a marketing person came up with.
I couldn't agree more, Bobbi. Well, Bobbi, I really appreciate you coming on the show and sharing your wisdom with us. Always enjoy our conversations, and I know we're going to have you back because there's a lot of other topics we want to talk about with you on the show. So thanks again for joining us. And where can people easily find you?
Sure. So first of all, my newest book, Launching Financial Grownups, is available everywhere. If you do purchase it, well, wherever you purchase it, but especially if you purchase on Amazon, but wherever you buy it, please leave a review if you like it. That really helps to support the book. And there's some kind of algorithm, I've been told, Kirk. I don't really know, but there's some sort of algorithm if they leave a review. Same thing for the podcast, Money Tips for Financial Grownups. Something good happens if you leave a review there. Leave a review for this show as well. And then my new business is called Financial Wellness Strategies. We're going to be working with employees through corporations to help them have just a more healthy mindset while taking action plans towards their financial goals. And then also working with wealth management firms to help bridge the gap between generations and help secure, the next generation's success in terms of their own money management, and making sure that the right tools are in place through the wealth managers to help make sure the next generation does what they want to be doing with whatever wealth they are fortunate enough to have.
Great. Well, thanks for sharing, Bobbi. We'll definitely have you back in the future.
Thank you so much for having me.
This is a public service announcement. Have you ever played the lottery? My state advertises that you can't win if you don't play. What they don't tell you is that the lottery is a tax on people who are bad at math. How many lottery winners have you met? Probably none. If you don't like your chances of winning the state lottery, you're definitely not going to like the chances of winning the inflationary lottery. The inflationary lottery? That's right. Your chances to win the state lottery might be 1 million to 1. But you're guaranteed to win the inflation lottery because it affects everyone. And the prizes stink. But here's what you're going to win. Higher prices at the store, shrinkflation in your packaged goods. Higher heating prices to heat your home. Who doesn't want to win that lottery? Much like the government, I feel bad that your costs are rising. So I want to help you out by giving you some free money. It's not a lot. It's only 1 million Zim dollars, but it's something. Well, you can't buy anything with it, but it does look good as wallpaper. And if you live in Europe, you might even be able to use it to heat your home this winter. If the lottery is a tax on people who are bad at math, then inflation is a tax on people who are bad at economics. I want my listeners to be better at economics. So I'm giving my loyal listeners free money. Go to www.moneytreepodcast.com/free money. Follow the instructions to get your free money today. I have a large audience and a limited number of these currencies. So let's make sure we get yours before we run out. Go to www.moneytreepodcast.com/free money. Follow the instructions and get your free money today. All right. Well, that was a great interview with Bobbi Rebel. Really appreciate her coming on the show. Always love her knowledge and wisdom. Now we're getting into the panel portion of the show. We have our very own Barb Friedberg. Hey, Barb.
Hello. Nice to be here, Kirk.
Great to have you once again. And we also have our very own Doug Heagren. Hey, Doug.
Hey, Kirk. Good morning to you. How are you doing today?
Doing great. So, Barb, let's start with you. What were some of your takeaways with the interview with Bobbi?
So much to think about. You've got to be conscious and mindful with your money. In other words, you just can't flit around and think, oh, I want $1 million, or I want to make money, or I want to buy this, or I want to do that. There's just so many forces in our culture that are weighing on us. And if you don't have a plan to figure out how are you going to spend your money, how are you going to save it, how are you going to invest it, then you're going to end up having less money, less life satisfaction than you would otherwise if you started out figuring out what you don't know, learning what you need to know, and starting a plan as early as possible to manage the wealth that manage the lifetime earnings that you're going to have.
That's great. Doug, what about you? What are some of your thoughts?
Barb had a good saying about, just understanding about that plan, right? So there's a saying called failure to plan is planning to fail. And this is what she spent her entire conversation basically talking about. The other thing I like is that, that she talked about is there are some distinct generational differences in the way we view money. And look, I enjoyed, of course, being a Gen Xer, like I think everybody on this panel is, understanding where we are kind of squeezed in this generational aspect. But what we grew up with and what we've learned and the way we're parenting and the way our parents parent, these all have significant impacts on us, and it impact how we think about money emotionally. They impact how we think about our ideals. She was talking one thing about the baby boomers. And one thing I want to say here is there's a saying, and again, don't quote me, and of course, this is a generalization, but the baby boomers lived to work. Okay. And this is why we're talking about how they haven't retired and they're still there. Gen X was taught that you got to work to be able to live. And I think our mentality for the most part was work hard, follow that green line. You're going to get there. You're going to make your money, and then you're finally going to have freedom. The next generations have a different philosophy of this, and there's pros and cons to both of it, but they live to live. Okay. And I think the one thing that both Kirk and you said about that is the one thing that I think they're doing right on that is they're understanding life is finite. Money is finite. Time is finite. You have to be able to find that balance, something the past generations didn't have. We are kind of that transitional generation, and this is going to have profound economic impact, but the new generations now realize you have to live life first. And I think that was an interesting takeaway as well.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a big trend towards that, certainly in younger generations. And, frankly, I think a lot of people need it, but they're so stuck in the old way of like, oh, you got to grind it out. You got to be a workaholic. You got to, work until you keel over. And it's just, I think the younger generation, maybe some of them taken to the other extreme, but I think as long as you find a balance, I think it's really where we should be focused on. I mean, some countries like Finland, Sweden, like they've integrated work-life balance much better than we have here in the U.S. Of course, we're more productive, so you could argue which is right, but either way, I think it's a healthy conversation to have. So, one thing I did want to ask is, it's come up because these different generations have different perspectives on investing and on finance. And, Barb, you deal with a lot of this with your writing. So how do you kind of see these different generations? How are they engaging with finance now compared to kind of what we're accustomed to?
It's really fascinating because with the advent of all the apps and all the new online investing, and it may not feel new to younger people, but to those of us who have been around for a while, I mean, I started investing, really at the beginning of when computers were becoming popular. And so when I had to buy a stock or a fund, I would go to my broker and I'd say, okay, I have X amount of dollars. Let's talk about how I should invest that. And then he, because they were pretty much all men, would say, well, why don't we invest in this? Why don't we invest in that? And I remember my first investments with my broker. And obviously, I didn't know a lot at that time. And I recognize now he put me in some investments that were beneficial to his company. And they were proprietary. And I'm sure he got a kickback for putting me in those investments. So that was a drawback back then. Well, today, many of us are left on our own with apps. And you can buy the commercials on TV are mind-boggling. You can sit in your chair. I think I'll come home from work and trade stocks. Well, that's not any better. And the missing piece here is between then and now is you've still got to do your homework. Even if you have a broker, even if you have a financial advisor, if you're investing on your own, whatever, you have to know what you're investing in. You have to educate yourself. There is no easy way around learning how to make smart investments. And I got a tip for you. A smart investment is not day trading.
I like that, Barb. Yeah, you mean it's not going on Robinhood and putting all your money in speculative options and expecting to be a millionaire overnight? You mean that's not investing?
Following your Reddit bros down the rabbit hole of let's screw the billionaires. I mean, so we can buy the stocks that they are shorting. The GameStops, which have absolutely no intrinsic value or little intrinsic value, but we'll buy them and we'll screw the billionaires because they've shorted them, and we'll make them close out their short positions. It's like, you don't invest to screw somebody else. I mean, that's just my opinion, but
diamond hands, Barb, diamond hands. No, I think that's really important. What Barb's saying. I think, I don't know. I feel like in the last bunch of years, our culture has kind of gone from, everyone kind of working hard, grit, just kind of trying to get ahead to now people are getting ahead by pulling other people down. Like, I want to get ahead by pulling down this billionaire. I'm going to do, and not to say that what they did wasn't kind of interesting, just to see that they could do it. And frankly, any investor, those hedge funds shouldn't be crying, because they do it to each other every single day. And if they saw a chance to do it to each other, they would. So the fact that they're crying about these retail investors, to me, is just laughable. But regardless, I think the thought process of trying to pull yourself up by pulling other people down is just misguided and dangerous. And so hopefully that's a trend that stops. But Doug, I did want to ask you, because I know you deal with this a lot with different generations, but how does finance and when you deal with younger clients, like, how do they see finance? Like, how do you handle their perspective versus the perspective of dealing with older clients?
Great question, Kirk. Actually, I got to tell you, as a positive to the younger generation, what I have found, and is that, and again, I'll go back to the generational side of things. The baby boomers, as we talked about, they hold most of the wealth that's out there. They still control that wealth. They're very much still controlling a lot of trends. And I think there's that control aspect that drives a lot of their decision making, right? They want to control everything, and they want to control the things they can't necessarily control, which, for example, comes down to rates of return, market performance, things like that. And in planning, there's this overlap. There's this overlap that you have to find between what matters and what you can control. And the only space you can play in is where those two things fit. And unfortunately, what happens is sometimes that power and that desire to have control leads to a lack of concern or focus, or a shift away from really thinking about what matters. And you talked about that a little bit in the interview, right? So how much money do you have? Well, if I get this, I'm going to retire, or I'm going to quit my job. And then they get there, and then that starts a new path, because there's this more, right? And so a lot of times what I'm having is this behavioral finance psychological conversation, which tends to be greater and more prevalent with older generations, because of the way that I think there's that control factor of what the way they were raised from their generational aspect. Okay. And this is just from my experience. Now, I start to look at the younger generations, And what I start to see there is that they seem to have a better focus on that matters aspect of it. Now, we could argue it's the opposite, okay? Instead of having a focus on what matters and then looking at how they can control to ensure that, they may put a focus on what matters to them and let the rest of their life go out of control, which potentially could be on the financial side, right? Of having any type of focus whatsoever on goals they're trying to hit. But in my experience, and again, I think every generation's got different people. So this is a generalization. But I have found that when I've been working with Gen X, but really Gen Y and Gen Z, for all of the okay boomer complaints there that that they say they hear, and then of course, oh, that lazy generation. What I have found, if you get through those generalizations, and again, the first thing you have to have is a plan, right? So if you are willing to step up and ask for the plan, which again, if I'm working with them, they've already started to engage that, correct? Those that have, I find more often than not, are much more disciplined in their approach than the older generations. They actually know what they want. They're willing to do it. I mean, Generation Z right now is the YouTube generation. They're not the ask for help generation. That, as the generations before us, they will go on YouTube, figure it out, because they don't have the money to outsource it, right? So when they get that information, when they crave that information, when they ask for that information, I have found that they tend to be very disciplined, almost like what they get off YouTube. If we follow this, I can create an outcome. And I find that when I do work with them and they've already asked for that help, they actually follow the plan extremely well, because they have a very strong balance about what matters to them and what they can control. And unfortunately, if you don't have that balance, you get too focused on the one side or the other, and the plan just doesn't come together. And I think that really, if we're going to have a theme of this whole conversation today, Kirk, it's balance. Find balance in everything you do, because without it, it doesn't end up working.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think balance is kind of understated and underestimated, definitely, by the older generations. Barb, one of the things that we talked about was dealing with older parents, which I think you've probably been through. So how should people be thinking about that? That's always a challenging conversation in kind of, working with, for clients, but just, dealing with family in general. So how should people be thinking about that?
I think one of the most important things when you're dealing with parents, if you're, older and really within an environment, is try to foster an environment of communication. My parents were not perfect, and God rest both their souls. They had their flaws. But one of the things they did amazingly well was transparency. We talked about money. I knew, once I was an adult, I knew what their financial situation was. I knew, it was an open communication, kind of like you should have with a spouse. Well, we had that in our family. I realize that is extremely rare. And so much of our biases, they just come from history, whatever the family culture is. And I think as parents, you guys have younger children than I do, create that environment of openness around talking about money issues. And like we've all been saying, Doug, you brought it up so clearly, balance. Look, you don't talk about money all the time. You don't talk about anything all the time, but adults who have older parents should really open the door to have that money conversation. I remember my father-in-law died at 103 a couple of years ago. And I remember talking, and he was not money savvy in any way, shape, or form. He and my mother-in-law kept their money 99% in certificates of deposit, which, worked out great when interest rates were 5 to 10%, and they could get those on their CDs. Not so great the last 15 years when they got like nothing. But we were talking about, and again, we didn't talk about money a lot during most of his life, but when he got older, we discussed it, which was a credit to him. And so he was showing me he had one mutual fund, and it was a bond fund, and interest rates were going up. And what happens when interest rates go up is the value of your bond fund goes down. Now, granted, my father-in-law was 98 at the time. And so he was upset that the value of his bond fund was going down. So I said to him, Mort, sell the fund now. Just sell it. You don't want to have to deal with a declining value. So he sold it. He kept the money, didn't get much yield on it over time at all. And of course, interest rates after that point, he kept living, which, of course, was a blessing for us all. He lived another 5 years, which, who knew? It was wonderful. He probably could have made more appreciation. But at the point, it was a good decision because we didn't know how long he had to live. And you want to lock in those money. You don't want losses at any time, but when you're 98, you definitely don't want losses. So have the conversation. Learn how to have the conversation with your family, your kids, your parents. And so you can all become smarter about money.
Yeah, I think it's a challenging conversation to have with the boomer generation, as they typically are pretty closed about money, and conversationally they're they're just so focused on earning and saving that, I mean, it was the generation before too. It was the same way. They just didn't talk about money. If you asked them, it was always this like charade of trying to get information from them, and they'd pretend like they didn't hear you. And it's just, to me, the conversation about money was just like talking about, like, sex and health. Like, it's just certain things you just don't talk about. Money's one of them.
Now, Kirk, was that the way it was with your parents as well?
To some extent. I mean, with my family, we didn't talk about money. I mean, my dad did with me because, I was interested in it, and he wanted to teach me, certain concepts. But, he wasn't, he was really good at saving. When it came to investing, he didn't have that skill set, and he didn't trust anybody, and rightly so, given the amount of fraud out there and the fact he was a criminal defense attorney dealing with those people. He didn't trust anybody. But I think I think conceptually, though, that generation didn't really talk about money, and if you asked, it was always kind of like, we'll talk about that later. So I think, and I've had conversations with clients talking to their elderly parents in those generations, and they say it's very hard. Even if they're kind of on the same page, they don't want to open up. They're just not accustomed to sharing. And I think it's a generational gap that's being filled by the opposite right now, with people that are sharing too much. I mean, why you'd want to share your whole financial situation on a public app for everyone to see is just beyond me. Maybe I'm glad I'm an extra. I'm right in the middle. Like, I'm not sharing with the public, but I'll share it with private, like just.
But maybe that's where the financial advisor comes in, because in their later years, although my parents were financially savvy, they had a financial advisor, and many boomers do. And that might be where the family conversation can come in, when you've got the advisor and you can say, hey, mom, dad, can I come to a meeting with you and the advisor so I can feel more prepared to know what's going on with our family, and I can be prepared to help you if the need arises.
Yeah, no, agreed. I did want to touch on one topic before we kind of wrap it up here in the interest of time. There was a story out today, or actually this past week, but since this is coming out a little later, listeners will have a little delay. But the story was that JP Morgan had bought a company called Frank, and apparently Frank just allegedly, it says the founder created 4 million fake customer accounts just before completing the sale. Needless to say, I'm sure JP Morgan will be suing them, but I wanted to bring it up because in times like this that we face, kind of recessions or not good times, but not even necessarily bad times, but things where things don't operate as expected, like 2008, the early 2000s, or even now, these frauds tend to come to the surface because you can't keep up Ponzi schemes unless the markets are going up to support it. So I want to talk about a little bit. So Doug, what you had some really insightful thoughts prior to this. So kind of what are your thoughts about these things?
We're talking about the apps. The funny thing, you made a comment on the show, Kirk, that Gen X was left to their own devices. And we now live in a generation where everybody is just left to devices, right? So, she talked about on the show, that, access to, and I think this is a great thing. We have access. And I was thinking about this earlier when Barb was talking about the first stock financial advisor she had, the stockbroker had to go get that information, right? Back in the day, the access to information was controlled. Okay. And because of that control, it could be easily manipulated. I mean, the reason we have a lot of the regulations we have now is from the Investment Advisors Act of the 1940s, right? Because there was so much disinformation. I mean, the Great Depression, a lot of it had to do with, a lot of manipulation of the stock market prior to the 20s and before. So, where we are getting the information the absence of regulation, unfortunately, leads to greed and opportunity that people take advantage of. And now we have access to information in ways that we've never had it in the course of history. But that can be a double-edged sword, right? Because now anybody can put anything out there of any type of information, and you've got to do your due diligence. It was one of the things we were talking about before this is the gas app that she brought up, which is great. Now there's an app for teens to be able to complement each other, which is great, because unfortunately, a lot of the apps that are out there, in order to get clicks and to get followers, they rely on shock and value and shock value and emotion. And really, unfortunately, if we look at reality TV going back, as in its heyday since the 2000s, everybody's trying to one up each other with more shock. And unfortunately, that leads to a lot of really negative things. And so, get on most social media, it's insult after insult after insult after attack after troll. And, all of a sudden they come out with this app that's now created to do compliments, to each other. And this app, Gas, actually, I just heard about it yesterday because it actually closed a deal to be acquired by Discord yesterday. It was released in August of last year. And here we are. It's not even, but just past the middle of January, and it's already sold. The irony of this is that the teenagers that were on it that started to get it built up, they've already started moving away from it about a month or two ago. Why? Because once it became popular, they wanted to move to different things. Okay. So, this information is changing. Where you get your information changes. You talked about Theranos and they talked about Kevin O'Leary. Even smart people have to do their due diligence and have been proven not to do the due diligence necessary to understand where that information is coming from. I go back, I think we've talked about this before, back in the 90s. There was right before the crash, there was a gentleman that was getting a ton of traffic, became one of the foremost authority on stock advice back in the 90s. Kind of reminds me of, as you were talking about earlier, Barb, stonks, right? That's the new thing. To the moon, Doge. My son says Doge all the time. You too, right? Well, he has no idea what it meant or the history of that. But back in the 90s, right before the crash, it turns out that this site that was being used for stock advice by more and more sophisticated people was run out of the home by a high schooler who was basically making it up. And ultimately, yeah, people made tons of money on it because the market just kept going up until all of a sudden it didn't, right? There was no substance or basis or foundational methodology being used for any of the recommendations. Well, guess what? We've seen that over the last 6 to 12 months with a lot of other investments that people have thrown their money into that a lot of time came from what I call historically cubicle advice. How should I invest my 401k? So to the person that works next to you, or you see, oh, look how my friends are doing. I need to get into that. This comes back to what we were talking about earlier, emotions. When you let emotions drive you, the fact that most people don't have a plan, they haven't put together the balance. Most people rely on nothing but rate of return and the desire to think that rate of return is going to achieve all of their financial success because they have no plan otherwise. And it's that fear. They may not consciously know that fear, but that fear is what drives them and say, look, in order for me to have enough, I've got to make more return. But with more return comes exponentially increasing risk. If you try to get 1% more in the markets, you're not going to take 1% more equal to risk. It's going to be an exponential level of risk. So this chasing of returns, ultimately, in many cases, with the absence of structural planning, which is why I also say there's a difference between someone who is your investment advisor, who is there to manage your investments and keep you emotionally stable during times of duress. By the way, that's when your investment advisor earns their money. It's not during the good times. You know, when you say, well, I'm not getting enough return. Based on what? Based on what the stock market's doing or based on what your plan requires? But the real value is when the markets become volatile, because they will hold you to the accountability of sticking to a plan that I hope you have. Now, ultimately, though, that's the difference between financial planning. Financial planning is not about just return. You need both. You need investment specialists that are going to manage their emotions through those investments at a proper allocation. But you also have to have that plan of what we talked about, what matters to you, when do you want to have it, and what is the steps and the process you need to have to get there, to diversify properly, to hold different things. I've said it before, I'll say it again. If you don't dislike something that you're holding, you're not diversified, okay? It's okay. You want to have things that are safe. This is good, this is bad, doesn't exist. They're all clubs in the golf bag, right? Cash value life might be a great thing for you. Stocks might be a great thing for you. Annuities might be a great thing for you. Precious metals, real estate. Actually holding all of them in your bag helps you play the course, because I've never seen someone be able to play 18 holes with just a sand wedge. Okay. But that's what people try to do. I've heard this is good. I've heard this is bad. They all work. I've actually got data that shows if you can just get 5% average over the course of 20 years, you're actually going to do better than what the actual market did over the last 20 years. As a matter of fact, since 2000, if you just tried to follow the stock market, you would have taken you till 2019 to beat a 5% average return if you could have just gotten that in an interest-bearing account. That's the difference between and why chasing returns does not work. And once again, it's about how you save. It's about how long you're going to work. It's about sticking to that plan. And when you get there, don't keep trying to do more. That's speculation. And ultimately, if you just rely on returns, which so many people do, you're probably going to put yourself in a situation where you ironically have less control than you would have if you had just let someone else deal with it and put it somewhere safe in the first place.
That's great. That's great advice, Doug. So where can people find more about you, Doug, as we wrap it up here?
Yeah, great. So we're talking about control. We're talking about that live to work to live to live, right? You got to have that balance. Listen, if you're an entrepreneur, if you're a business owner out there, and a lot of people who listen to the show, I know are, look, that's the biggest thing you battle every day, right? Is work-life balance. Is you got into this to run a business that would hopefully create opportunity, freedom, wealth. But why? It's not just about having dollars. A pile of money does nothing. Ask the Germans in the 1920s, right? It's about what can you do with that? Listen, as a business owner, build your business, accelerate your ability to live, okay? In order to do that, you got to have a business that thrives without you, that's built efficiently. And as we go into more economic turmoil, you're going to find out the businesses that are built correctly and the businesses that aren't. And the ones that aren't built correctly, they're going to have even greater value. So find out more how to do that, how to live to live. If you're a business owner, you can look us up, learn more about us at automaticbusinessmethod.com. automaticbusinessmethod.com. Learn about the process to increase the value of your business, but also build a business that thrives without you.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us, Doug. And Barb, final thoughts from you, where people will find more about you.
Final thoughts, do your homework. And what that means is reading the stuff you don't want to read. When they say a prospectus is something you need to read before investing, they're not doing that for themselves. They're doing it for you. So I know all that small legal information is really boring, but force yourself to read it because you will become wealthier and less vulnerable if you do, because risks are always included in any sort of prospectus that you will receive, at least if it's regulated by the Securities and Exchange Commission. So I'm Barbara Friedberg. You can find me on YouTube and at Barbara Friedberg Personal Finance. See you next time. Bye.
Thanks for coming on, Barb. That's the show for this week. Thank you again for joining us on Money Tree Investing Podcast. My name's Kirk Chisholm, Wealth Manager of Innovative Advisor Group. We don't just manage your wealth, we make your life better. You can find more about me at innovativewealth.com. And of course, you can find me every week here on this show. You can also check out our show at Money Tree Investing Podcast. On our website, you'll have access to the show notes, resources, and the archive shows. Please remember to subscribe on our YouTube channel for immediate access to the new shows when they're released. When you subscribe to the show, it allows us to get access to some of the top minds of investing in personal finance. While you're here, please leave a comment and question if you want us to address it on the show. Have a great week ahead, and remember, no one will care about your money like you do, so invest in your life.